All right, so welcome back, everybody, on YouTube and what other places do we broadcast our
Vine? Is
videos?
Vine still a thing? Or that's
Fine, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Brendan Anderson, the founder of Climate People. I'm really excited today to be talking to Nathan Wasserman. Nathan and I met last year. We were actually talking about how did we get introduced again last year? Do you remember?
I'm pretty sure I hit you up on LinkedIn because I saw your profile and I was like, oh, you do recruiting and you're in climate and my brother's in recruiting. That's an easy conversation starter. And at this point in time, and I'm probably still there, but I was like, if they had climate in their profile, it was, hey, are you free for a 30-minute coffee chat?
So that's a really interesting, okay, we'll come back to that because actually that is a really great tip that we can dig into a little bit for potential job seekers in the space. So anyway, introducing Nathan to the Climate People audience, and we're going to talk a little bit about your origin story, obviously kind of your work transition, and obviously we want to dig in a little bit on the podcast too. So thank you very much. And yeah, it's happy to talk to you today about a couple different topics. Number one being that you're a podcast host and I'm asking you questions and I'm interviewing the expert on interviewing. So I'm not going to do nearly as well as you. Again, free flowing too. So I guess first and foremost, we're here to talk to you today about your job transition. So you're now taking a new position. So I guess we'll start there. Where are you taking a job?
Yeah, I'm taking a job at Persephone, the leading carbon accounting and management platform.
That's exciting. So what are you going to be doing for Persephone?
Yeah, I'm going to be the director or one of the directors of carbon and climate solutions. And as I understand it, ask me in a week when I've been there or maybe two. But once someone signs onto the platform, they have a direct correspondent with Persephone, and that's going to be me or someone else in the similar role to help them onboard onto the platform and make sure that they're getting the most out of it. So they're making sure that they're calculating their emissions correctly, they're deriving the right insights, and then they're using that to drive impact both in their organization and then also obviously in the environment as well.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So what was it about Persephone that attracted you to want to take a job there?
Yeah, so I think like starting on the funnel, I would say at large, I'm very excited about carbon accounting. Love numbers, big numbers nerd. It's also the first step in any major change process, right? You have to like measure it and figure out where are we. You can have big goals, but unless you can measure those goals, you don't know if you're going to make an impact. And so for that reason, carbon accounting excited me. The other is that Persephone had an early jump on this space. I mean, they were one of the first, if not the first, to get in here. They've got an amazing team. I mean, it's really, you look at it and you're like, I don't know which basketball reference to choose because like LeBron James has been on so many superstar teams, but Lakers with AD or Miami with like Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade, but the team is just incredible. The people that the founders and the people they've hired are people that I'm really excited to be on, and not to compare it to where I am today. But I'm really excited to learn from these leaders. I'm being hired to make an impact, and which is great. But I think every person in any role that they're getting should be looking to go. Let me rephrase that. Any person, when you're starting a new role, like one of the major indicators there needs to be, are you going to learn? And I feel like I'm going to learn a tremendous amount of Persephone.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And it will be interesting if we could flash forward and put another call on the calendar 6 months from now and talk about that growth, both in terms of your own personal experience and the work that you're doing, but also what you've learned and where the company's at 6 months from now, because I have a feeling that the trajectory of the organization, it's a rocket ship and these guys are going to really take off.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think a huge part of that will also be policy. Policy will help them make that happen, but
yeah.
So yeah,
Nat, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, you just touched on impact a little bit. So I was going to see if you could tell us a little bit about your sustainability journey and why you wanted to get a job that made that impact.
Yeah, it's so fun to be on the other side of the camera or microphone. So I caught the bug. I like to say aviation was my first love. My mom was super thrifty when it came to birthday parties, and there's like a small airport near our house growing up. I think it was like 7 or 8. but we like had a birthday party at the College Park, Maryland airport, which is allegedly the longest continuous running airport in the world. And I like spent the whole time on the flight simulator, which was like really crappy free simulator that was great. And so aviation was my first love. And I went to work for Boeing right after college. And one of the perks of Boeing is that they have they have it's called a Learning Together program. And so they'll help fund your continuing education. So I ended up taking a master's at USC, or doing a master's at USC. And I took this class at the very end called Industry and the Environment. And it was it just looked interesting to me. It was within the catalog of electives that were kosher. And it blew me away. I mean, one thing that was so different from my master's and undergrad, and we're a little bit on a tangent here, is that I really got to choose the classes I wanted to. In undergrad in aerospace engineering, they walk in and they're like, here's your catalog for the next 4 years. Like, just do all these things and we'll give you a degree. And in my master's degree, I really got to take classes that interest me. And it's like, oh, that looks cool. Like in general, I like nature, is why I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. Not that the East Coast doesn't have nature, but it's just a little bit worse. No shade. And so, yeah, I mean, I took the class and it blew my mind. I would like, that's when I like my sustainability consciousness kicked off. But in particular, there was one reading assignment, and I'll have to like pull it up, put it in the equivalent of the show notes. But it was like the future change in the Earth's biosphere or whatever it was. And it was this paper in Nature. And it was like, these are all the things that have already happened. And then if we hit these, what we like in Amazon, what we would call one-way doors, then we're screwed. It was basically like all the things that we hear about, like, the methane gets released in kind of the North Pole ice cap and all this stuff. And I was like, oh my God, we are so doomed. And it's also so aligned, like, not let's say that we're all doomed, I'll take that back, but there's like, we have like so many important things we need to change. And personally, I'm all about like reduce, reuse, recycle in that order. And so it was a perfect fit. So while aviation was my first love, sustainability is definitely my second love.
So, okay, so coming back into the workspace, then how did you, I could go in a bunch of different ways, like as I ask this question. So let's start with within your job, right? Like there are a lot of ways to make an impact, both within your job, certainly from the climate people's perspective, like what we're focusing on is getting people jobs in the space. But if you, just within your career itself, like how did you go from working in supply chain management to then getting into sustainability? Like how did that actually transform?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a great essay also put in the show notes. I think it's from Green Biz, but it's, every job is a climate job. Like you don't have to have a title for climate or sustainability to be in climate. But the first things I did, I was doing supply chain strategy, and I started the sustainability. And I am currently in, probably when this released, I won't be, but I work for Amazon Air, which is Amazon's cargo airline. And I started a group called the Amazon Air Sustainability Working Group, where we would just write white papers or really short essays that say like, hey, like what is sustainability? And this is pre-Amazon's climate pledge. So still relatively early in the game for Amazon, and Amazon was a latecomer. I mean, compared to like Microsoft and Google, Amazon was a little bit behind the curve. So we're writing these white papers, and it was in my spare time. And then at that point, I like knew sustainability is where I wanted to go. I had started the podcast, the Net Zero Life, and the person who I started the Amazon Air Sustainability Working Group with, or kind of who like was my sponsor, had a open role to be the leader of sustainability for Amazon Air, the strategic leader. And so he was pinging me being like, hey, this role is perfect for you. You got to take this. And that was because I had already shown the initiative and the interest to go do it. And he knew about the podcast and he knew I had the knowledge. And so those two things kind of collided together. And eventually I agreed to take on the role.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And then the podcast itself, what was the origin story around the podcast? Why did you decide to start it up?
It's a great, I just, maybe like Natalie, if I'm like not doing 50 things at once, I'm unhappy. And so I was like, what is a side hustle? And I wanted to do a side hustle. I wanted to be my own. I'm a control freak. And so, at Amazon, you don't get to be a control freak. It controls you. And so I was like, okay, how can I have something that's my own? And I thought about a few different things. And I landed on podcasts for two reasons. One, I personally, and this is ironic because here you're asking me questions, I personally don't find myself very interesting, But a podcast is easy because you just have to ask interesting questions and then the other person takes it away. So that was great. And then the other was also, I mean, again, to like pull back the curtain, it was super strategic. Like I wanted to leverage the guests audience as well, right? As a way to grow content. And then, those two things, plus the fact that it was something that I could do in a reasonable amount of time, being like, early mornings, late nights, and weekends, and still do my full-time job. Those three, I think, are kind of like the honest three levers that I pulled and why I went for it.
And I got to imagine, well, I don't have to imagine, I know for a fact, having spoken to you and going through not a podcast per se, but from a business perspective, I'm learning so much as like the more and more I talk to people that are in the space, that you've obviously walked away with a tremendous amount of information, tremendous amount of knowledge about what's happening across the entire climate landscape, both from a business perspective, from a policy perspective, from a media perspective, obviously just having spoken with Nat last week, 2 weeks ago, a couple weeks ago. What are some of the trends that you're seeing as you're talking to people across the landscape? Maybe not 10 years. We know that this next decade is obviously massively important. What are some of the biggest trends that you're seeing? Obviously, you're jumping into a company that's doing carbon accounting because of the measurement aspect of it, right? Are there other big trends that you see across the entire climate tech landscape that, from your perspective, having spoken to such a wide range of people?
Totally. And then, we should maybe disclose. So Climate People was the partner for season 2 of the Net Zero Life, the podcast. And we are so grateful. I think it was an amazing partnership. I just sent over a summary of the impact we made, but I think it was a huge success. And I know our listeners that have talked to me have said amazing things. So thank you to Climate People for believing in us. So what have I learned? I think there's two things. There's like kind of the, like if I was an investor lens, I could go down that path, or I can talk about like kind of like if I'm a person who cares about the environment. And those two paths like are they merge, but they are different. And I'm happy to talk about either one. Any?
Well, why don't we start with, because the lens for which we look at things is really from a job searching lens, right? Yeah. So I think that would be more probably the investor side, right? Because that's where the growth is. Okay. So what have you seen, or what are some of your takeaways from talking with folks in that space?
If I'm an investor, first of all, I think you should start a podcast and go interview your founders before you invest with them, because in starting a podcast, you have to really think, doing a podcast episode, you have to think very hard about the questions that you want. You could walk into it, but it's going to be disinteresting if you don't. And just coming up with great questions is a great way to think about a business. So, plug there. There's a few different timelines, and there's first and foremost, it's a crowded space. There are a lot of people in there right now, unbelievable amounts of money. I mean, there was like 16 or 17 billion invested in startups just in the first 6 months, and projected to go to like 30 to 35 billion. So it's really easy to get money there right now, which means I think if you're an investor or if you're a person trying to pick a company, and if you care about being right, like the idea in the climate space is just like we need more shots on goal, and so the fact that like yours might not be the right one might not matter in the long run, as long as somebody hits it right. But if you do care, like know that there's just a lot out there, and you can go start it yourself. You could probably do it. And there's different time horizons. That's something that we're seeing very different. So we've got kind of these like really, carbon removal is a hugely popular industry right now. There are great podcasts on that. We interviewed Nan Ranzelhoff from Stripe. She's also been on a bunch of other different pods, including My Climate Journey and Shell Khan's new show, The Catalyst. But so carbon accounting is this really long time horizon as an investor. You're gonna have to have your money in that pot 10, 15 plus years. You're trying to build the reverse of the oil industry. So there's a lot of money going there. It was super interesting. We're also hopefully gonna see government money go in that space as well. So that could change it. So that's just like in terms of the time scale, that's like the farthest out. And so if you're looking to get into that, make sure you have that understanding either as an employee or an investor. Conversely, on the software is where you get the quickest returns. And so then this maybe shows my cards a little bit in terms of I chose a software company, and I think carbon accounting and that tranche of carbon software startups is going to be kind of your first classic exits. And that's just because, like, first of all, you have to measure. A lot of the information is already there. I mean, the space that needs to be filled is going to be the accuracy. I think the precision is there because there's a lot of companies circling around the same numbers, but the actual accuracy of those numbers is to be determined. And then there's nonprofits working on that, like Climate Trace, which is by Watt Time. They're super cool. But you've got, Science Technologies, Watershed, Persephone, and that's just like kind of the big names. Plan A, there's so many other companies out there that are doing ESG reporting metrics. And so I think those two things jump out in particular. On the energy side, that's probably the most mature, and let me know when you're bored. That's the most mature industry because that's been around for a while. And so we talk to companies like Illumia, and other people are reaching out, similar business, which is like they're going to help you save energy. And when we talk to on the policy side, ACEEE, which is like that in order to reach net zero, we're going to have to save just as much as we invent. We've got to be more efficient. And so those are things like updated HVAC, and we talked to a company, James Dean with Oxygenate, who they're making more efficient HVAC equipment, in particular ventilation for them, updating your lighting to LEDs, having smart controls, all that stuff. And so that's an industry as well that I think there's already a proven profit maker, right? Which is like, you show me, you save, we share that savings either at some sort of like annual subscription, or we're going to split it the difference one way or another. So those are a few opportunities that come up right off the bat.
Yeah, it's really not being an experienced podcast host, didn't write out all these questions ahead of time and really think about it. But as you're going through, I think you and I could probably sit here and talk for hours about these kinds of things, because I'm seeing a lot of the same trends, certainly as we think about it from a job search perspective, and really the climate people focus for the time being is on the software and technology side, because that's where our skills most align and our knowledge base. But going back to the carbon removal piece, what's really interesting is that the first customer that we worked with when we started up the company was Heirloom Carbon with Shashank. And they're fantastic, amazing technology. But the kinds of roles that they were hiring for were all like, deep scientific, deep technology, heavy engineering types of roles. And there's some software involved, but very limited. It happens to be more on the control side than the real software engineering and data side. So it wasn't a strong fit for the kinds of positions that we were replacing right now. But down the road, they're probably going to have lots of software needs, and companies like them will have lots of software needs. But we're still probably several years out. If you look at the other leaders in that space between Charm and Climeworks and Carbon Engineering, almost none of those companies have software jobs, but they all have these other kinds of hard engineering and deep technical types of positions. So I think there's market opportunity there for somebody who wants to fill in that gap. We're focusing really on the software side of it that brings to all the other types of businesses that we were just talking about, where there's literally thousands of jobs that are available in that space.
100%. And I guess reflecting, we didn't touch about like food and ag or transportation. Right. Like there's so much out there. And the other thing is like we not only is every job a climate job, but any job can be a climate job, which is that when people ask me like, what should I study to go be in sustainability? It's like, go get skills, and go learn a trait, and then apply that in a methodology that is sustainability oriented. So if you're a controls engineer and you work for Boeing, go figure out how to apply those mechanical hydraulic skills to Heirloom Carbon. And it doesn't have to have sustainability in your degree. In fact, oftentimes it helps to have typically a STEM or even STEAM. I'm sure art plays a way in this too. So
yeah. Well, I would say for sure art does, right? Because you see what the folks over at Peak Action are doing right now, right? And there's better storytelling that needs to happen within the climate space in general. So it's not just focusing on the doom, and if we don't do this stuff, like the world's going to come to an end, or it's what are the opportunities that exist, and what are the types of stories of what the future can be, a cleaner future, a healthier future, by focusing on these technologies. So
totally. And just also like to plug that, two of my favorite, I don't have favorite guests, two of the guests on the Net Zero Life have backgrounds in art. So Linda Pulio, who founded Dishcraft, background in art, and Nat Bloomberg, Nat Bullard, who's the chief content officer of Bloomberg NEF, also has a background in art. So Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So one of the things that we are coming up against on a daily basis when we're talking with candidates that are looking to make a move into the space is their lack of knowledge that exists, that these jobs are even out there. Again, thinking from a software and data and even product and user experience standpoint, a lot of people in those fields don't realize that there are good jobs within climate impact organizations. That's one of the barriers that we see. Are there other barriers of entry that you've seen in your experience for people that are looking to get into the space? And then I'd say the kind of follow-up to that would be, what are some of the solutions that you think are out there for people that want to move into the space, but maybe just either don't know that these jobs exist, or certainly even this interview and us trying to get that out there, right, is going to be helpful. But what are some of the barriers, and do you have any ideas on some solutions?
Yeah, totally. I would say it's a classic one, which is like the misalignment of it, like wanting experience versus having experience. So a lot of people who want the jobs don't necessarily have the experience. And a lot of people who are hiring want more experience, or people who have the knowledge set. So I think there's that mismatch is pretty classic. So that's one. The other is that I think there are industries who are typical for moving, and software is one of those, right? But where I came from, like hard engineering, you go in there, I mean, it's the same thing. Like everyone has a 10-year time horizon, 15-year time horizon. Developing a new airplane is the same thing. So these people are in it for the long haul, and they really want to see their impact through. And so it's a harder sell to someone who's like working on developing the newest and latest and greatest airplane to say, hey, stop what you're doing, even though you're in the second of 5 gates for your product lifecycle, and then it's going to be manufactured 5 years later, and come over and start a new 10-year project. Versus in software, it's like, congratulations, like you push your code and 30 days later, bam, like you can see your website, right, or whatever. And so it's an easier sell. And I think it's just telling the story of those people, those engineers who are on that train, and to say, hey, like, I know you're on a great train right now, but listen, climate's also really, I mean, we can sell the story in multiple ways. I'm going to choose to sell right here from a profitability standpoint, which is that it's a great time to get into climate. There's a lot of money in that space. Like, not only are you going to like make an impact and work with a really smart group of motivated people, but you're going to be financially rewarded to do that. And as much as we don't like capitalism, it has done a lot of good for the world. We talked about it on the podcast. Happy to dig into it more. But
I mean, you and I have talked about that as well, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yeah.
Money is a value, is a trade of value. And the fact is that like people are valuing climate jobs right now, and you will be financially rewarded in addition to having an impact. So, go do it.
Yeah. So following on that point, and we'll start to wrap things up here. We just did a quick report. Natalie's putting together the information for kind of an end of year report, and I think we've placed 30 people so far this year into climate jobs, and that is nothing compared to what our goals are, right? What we want to do. We want to get as many people jobs as to start, but the average salaries, and it's an average, of course, but the average salary was 178K.
And, I don't know how that compares to software in general, but I can just personally, I feel comfortable saying that like I am super blessed and had an awesome opportunity to join Persephone, and the compensation was a part of that package. Yeah.
And I think that's the point, right? Like, people assume that, number one, that so number one, that they don't even know that these jobs exist. And number two, that those that decide that they want to go down this path think that they need to take a pay cut, right? And the reality is that unless they're coming out of Meta or some of these other really big tech companies, like, they probably don't need to take a pay cut.
Totally. And if you need excuses to leave Meta, money shouldn't be the one.
Well, yeah, exactly. Okay.
Now, were you gonna jump in? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, yeah. I was just gonna ask a little bit more generally about like your experience working with climate people too, and see if you could touch on a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. Well, they're the best. I genuinely, I say it in every podcast episode, and I genuinely mean it. It was my first experience working with a recruiting agency, and my brother is a recruiter who works for an agency as well. And so after I got my job offer, he was like, "Oh, so your first experience of an agency is a good one." And I was like, "Yeah, it was." It's awesome. You have an advocate for you when you're interviewing through the process. And in general, I think having an advocate, sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear the sirens here, but it's cool. Just like in general, having an advocate for anything you do is so helpful. Someone that you can rely on and open up to. Brendan, and I could say like, hey, I'm not sure about X, Y, and Z. You're like, listen, this is what it is. And there's a different value proposition for everyone. Again, like going back to like capitalism in the markets. I think it works fantastic, and super grateful that I got to know the two of you, and truly changed my life. So
I'm so happy to hear that. That's awesome. Yeah, and then so like to wrap things up, I guess the last thing, as we've mentioned to you before, I'm pretty sure Brendan's brought it up. We donate 1% of every placement fee to an environmental nonprofit. We found 4 nonprofits that really exemplify our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So yeah, we have Soulfire Farm, the Venture Out Project, the Honnold Foundation, and oh goodness, which one am I missing?
The Indigenous Environmental
Network. So did you have a chance to look at those and see which one you would like to donate to?
I think I hate to be the person who asks to do it a little bit differently, but in this most recent season of the Net Zero Life, we interviewed Andrea Johnson, the executive director of Green Empowerment, and they are part of the 1% for the Planet. And so I love their work. I think it overlaps with much of the 4 that you identified. And so if possible, I would love to donate to them.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great too.
Yep.
For sure.
What was it about that organization, Nathan? Why them? Right.
Yeah.
Because we're also looking at our 2022 partners, right? And that's this is an annual thing that we're going to do. And each year we may have partners that would roll over and carry over from year to year, but part of it too is that the partnership, like we want to develop a relationship and have a partnership with the companies that we are trying to amplify and make sure that other people are aware of these organizations.
Totally. I'm still crystallizing the thought exactly, but I'd say it's around 2 things. One, in general, it's kind of it's not the Andrew Carnegie like manifesto of the wealthy, but a little bit I think as the US has benefited from massive amount of carbon intensive resources, we have a responsibility to help non-US people to develop in a way that is climate friendly. It's not fair to say you shouldn't be burning coal unless we are the ones supplementing that. And Climate People, and Climate People does that as well, but Green Empowerment does that. And they also do it with like a non-Western viewpoint in the way that they're going to these local communities and working with them to have access to clean electricity and clean water, 2 super important resources. We talk about carbon all the time, but water is like more and more going to become a conversation. And then so they're doing it in such an impactful way where they're also like really sciencey about it, which I love. Like I'm a big science nerd about like measuring impact. And the last thing is they're trying to figure out how to scale their work. And that's a very Western capital idea. Like how do you do a one-to-many model? But the fact is like that their model relies on these one-to-one relationships, which is expensive, but it works. And it's also something, again, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I feel about it. But I totally believe that to like make an impact, it requires that one-to-one relationship. So
yeah, there's I appreciate that, and we absolutely want to support them not only through your placement and that donation, but I'd be interested in having a conversation because in a lot of ways it seems like there's some common challenges that exist, right? Even in our business, right? Like where there are recruiters out there that scale their businesses, but they do that through automation and they lose that personal touch. And what we're really focusing on is the mission, and we want to have that personal touch. So how do we scale this, but still have the relationship and that one-to-one touch is incredibly difficult. I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around it, but I'm trying to figure it out.
Totally. And then, I mean, like just like the example, I know we can talk for hours here. I'm already, but you've got like Indeed, right? Which is the opposite of like a personal relationship. Then you've got a recruiting agency where you've got like 100% relationship. And like one way to scale is just to have the best recruiters. And I think your team already is, but then how do you figure out how to make those best recruiters even better? And like Atul Gawande talks a lot about this with doctors, right? Because doctors by definition are a one-to-one. And so maybe check out his book Better. Amazing book, and see if you can apply it to climate people.
Yeah, I love it. Good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much for everything. Obviously, the podcast and allowing us to be a partner with you on the podcast, it's been tremendous. The work that you've been doing for Amazon Air and sustainability is tremendous. And then, taking your skills and experience to help scale an organization like Persephone, we really appreciate you. So thank you very much. Natalie, was there anything else before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to say thank you as well. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And just really all the climate communications and getting that word out there is so monumental. So yeah, we really appreciate all the work that you've done and all.
Yeah, guys, thank you. I'm super grateful, super lucky to know both of you.